Hello, everyone. My name is Anne Deschamps, and I'm joined by Nancy Horton. We are with TransCen's MidAtlantic ADA Information Center, and we are here to talk about voting. As part of our research, we conducted a survey of state and local government employees who have responsibilities to implement the ADA and make sure people with disabilities can access and participate in public programs in their communities. We learned that one of the issues these public employees find most challenging is structural access. Access to buildings and facilities where programs and activities take place. So we thought it would be timely to talk about that issue, specifically in terms of polling places and access to voting. Nancy, you respond to a lot of questions we get on our 800 line about structural access. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of questions people have been asking about polling places?
Well, we get a wide variety of questions about access to polling places, ranging from very specific questions, such as how many accessible parking spaces should be provided or how wide a doorway should be, to more fundamental questions, especially where polling places are located in older buildings, which many of them are. We get questions like, how does the ADA apply to older buildings? Do all older buildings have to comply with current ADA standards? Or are historic buildings exempt from the ADA?
You know, that brings up a really good point, because there's such a wide variety of places used for voting all across the country. I imagine that can present some challenges.
It certainly can. Many communities, in an effort to make voting as convenient as possible, have lots of polling places. Polling places may be located in public buildings like schools, which are used for public purposes every day, are covered by the ADA, and have obligations to generally be accessible to people with disabilities. That doesn't necessarily mean they are all perfectly accessible, but it does mean that accessibility should be on their radar all the time and not just on election days. Polling places might also be located in private buildings, which are only used for this public purpose on election days. So we may have older buildings, we may have historic buildings, and we may have private buildings, including buildings not covered by ADA requirements. For example, religious entities. My own polling place is located in a church, which has no obligation on its own under the ADA to be accessible to the public, because religious entities are exempt from the part of the ADA that requires accessibility in private buildings. But the state or local government holding the election, the public entity, does have an obligation to make sure that the opportunity to vote is accessible to eligible individuals with disabilities in my neighborhood.
Okay, so to take your polling place as an example, let's say the church has a step to get into the space used for voting. Does the state or local government need to build a ramp to make sure people who use wheelchairs or have other mobility disabilities can vote there on election day?
Well, not necessarily. There may be a number of things that can be done to make sure people with disabilities can vote in that neighborhood. Title II of the ADA, which applies to state and local governments, includes a concept called program accessibility, which applies to programs, services, and activities that take place in older, inaccessible buildings. This means that the focus is really on the program or activity, in this case, voting. So, for example, if a polling place is located in an inaccessible historic building, how are you going to make sure people using wheelchairs or other mobility devices can vote? There may be a number of options, including simply looking to see if they can designate a different polling place that is more accessible and is in a comparably convenient location within the community. There may also be options for providing temporary accessibility features at an existing polling place. Portable ramps may be set up, or temporary accessible parking spaces may be designated and reserved for individuals with disabilities. Something as simple as propping open a heavy door can make a big difference in making voting more accessible and more user-friendly.
Now, what about options like voting by mail? Should those be offered as alternatives?
Well, those kinds of alternatives should certainly be offered where they are available, and many people with disabilities, just like people without disabilities, will welcome options like voting by mail because it's convenient. People can vote without ever having to go to a polling place or stand in line, deal with transportation issues, inclement weather, taking time off work, or any of that. However, typical vote-by-mail ballots are paper ballots, which must be read and marked, and they do not allow some voters with disabilities, such as some voters who are blind, to vote as independently and privately as they should be able to and might be able to at a polling place with an accessible voting machine. So accessible options need to be available, such as an electronic remote voting option. However, remote voting alternatives should not necessarily be considered the only solutions to inaccessible polling places if physical polling places are going to be open. Where accessible polling places can be chosen or existing polling places can be made accessible, either with permanent improvements or with temporary measures for election days, those things should be done. On this slide, we have a couple images illustrating some temporary fixes, which can be good solutions for inaccessible polling places, but are not always considered. In the image on the left, they've created a temporary accessible parking space. They have a temporary sign placed at the head of a parking space, and they've placed traffic cones across the foot of a couple adjacent spaces to block them off, creating the space needed for an individual with a disability to deploy a ramp or lift and get in and out of their vehicle, and then also get to the temporary ramp that's been placed there to provide access from the parking surface up onto the sidewalk. The image on the right shows another temporary ramp that's been placed over a couple steps at the entrance to a polling place. This is a full ramp with appropriate slope, handrails, and edge protection. So that's also a good reminder for us that temporary measures need to be done properly so they are usable and safe.
So you mentioned emerging technologies that facilitate remote voting. Is that the wave of the future? Will physical voting places go by the way of the horse and buggy?
Perhaps someday. We certainly are seeing a rapid pace of development in technology, but we also still see accessibility overlooked at times. People who are blind or deaf or have limited mobility, cognitive disabilities, or other types of disabilities encounter difficulties on a daily basis in using websites, mobile apps, and all kinds of other technologies. Designers and developers of technologies, as well as state and local government officials who are responsible for procurement, implementation, or maintenance of technologies, do not always get the training or support they need to ensure accessibility. So this is a big issue as we move forward with the development of voting technologies. Innovation is great, and it's great to have more options, but technology options need to be as accessible as possible and not just a convenience for some. In any event, there are still people with or without disabilities who want or need to vote in person. People who are homeless and may have limitations in getting or returning mail, people who don't have access to technology or have difficulty using it may need in-person voting opportunities. Some people just like to go to their neighborhood polling places. They enjoy election day traditions, and some people take their children along to instill an appreciation for the right and responsibility of voting. So we may still need at least some physical polling places for the foreseeable future. And as long as polling places are available, people with disabilities should be able to use them as others do.
Yeah, that reminds me, Nancy, when I was growing up a long time ago, my mom used to take my brother and my sister and I, all of us, march down to our neighborhood polling place and vote from a very young age. And every single year it was a big deal because she really believed strongly that if you had the opportunity to vote and you were old enough to vote, that you really needed to, it was your civic responsibility and you needed to do it. So that got passed down to my brother, sister, and I, and it was interesting as we were raising our own kids, we did the exact same thing. And now that all our kids are grown, they understand how important voting is. And how important that these places be accessible to everybody. Now, are there additional concerns, Nancy, about polling places this year because of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I'm sure that many people with or without disabilities have concerns about in-person voting during the pandemic, and many states and localities are expanding voting by mail or other remote options, as well as options for early voting at physical polling places, all of which may help reduce crowds at polling places on election day. And I'm sure that election officials and poll workers will be taking the kinds of measures that we're seeing throughout public spaces, using face masks and coverings, adjusting circulation routes, practicing social distancing, cleaning surfaces and equipment, to ensure that all people who vote in person will be able to do so safely. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, has a resource page called Considerations for Election Polling Locations and Voters, which offers a lot of practical information about how to ensure safe voting. It's very well organized and user-friendly. And if people with disabilities have specific questions or concerns about voting in person, I would urge them to contact their local election office to discuss their needs and find out about options that may be available.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Now, before we wrap up, we want to leave you with some top tips for planning and conducting accessible elections. First, you want to look for accessible polling places and consider general access issues such as proximity to public transit. Second, you want to consider temporary measures such as portable ramps that may make it possible to use convenient locations as polling places on election day. And don't forget the signs. Definitely don't forget the signs. Take time to post signs that will help voters find their way to and around polling places, especially where accessible features may not be obvious. For example, where accessible entrance is different from the main entrance, or where accessible features might be temporary. Train poll workers and volunteers on accessible features of the polling place, voting machines, and how they may need to assist people with disabilities, and make sure they're comfortable doing that. Make sure the communications are accessible. Websites are designed to be accessible to individuals with disabilities who use assistive technology. Public service announcements include captioning. Voter registration and election materials are available in accessible formats such as large print. There's a lot to take into consideration here. And last, please make sure accessibility is part of the purchasing and contract considerations. Insist that subcontractors, equipment vendors, web designers, and other providers follow accessibility guidelines and standards. We also want to share a couple of great resources. From the U.S. Department of Justice, we have the ADA checklist for polling places and solutions for 5 common ADA access problems at polling places, both which can be found at ada.gov. And then from the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, we have voting accessibility, which can also be found on their website. Now, as we wrap up, we want to remind everybody that we are part of the ADA National Network, which includes 10 regional centers that provide guidance, training, and materials on the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can always call 1-800-949-4232, and you will be connected to the regional ADA center based on the area code of the phone number you call from. Or you can visit the national website at adata.org. The network is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, NIDLR, which is within the Administration for Community Living in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The MidAtlantic ADA Center is operated by TransCen Incorporated, which works to improve the lives of people with disabilities through meaningful work and community inclusion. You can reach us at the toll-free number 800-949-4232 in Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia, or visit us online at adainfo.org. Thank you for joining us. Access to polling places can present both challenges and opportunities to improve community engagement and participation in our democracy. Voting is a foundation of our democracy, and it is so important that everyone who is eligible to vote is able to do so privately, independently, and safely.